Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are there any people here today who were not here last week? Only a few. Okay. I will try to adjust according to that. We had a good time last week. I hope y'all did. Those of us that are interested in some of this old stuff and old furniture and old houses and old interiors, I call it a gene defect, but I can't seem to do much about it. So anyhow, it kept me off the streets, kept me out of trouble. So we enjoyed having you. I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and I'm going to comment in general. We have things up here on the table that can look at. The two Guilford Lemons, which are mine and Sarah's, look at them but don't handle them, please. But they are the real deal. And so Sally's going to be talking about that. And there's some other information up here on some of the stuff that Sarah and I have done, that if people are interested in stuff later on that, which is on the northeast corner of the county. Last week I'm going to introduce Sally first, ladies first. Sally Gant we've known Sally, Sarah and I have, for 30 years. She's only 40 now, but we've known her since she was 10. We've known Sally at least 30 years at Mazda. I've always joked that I think she never sleeps, because we've been on graduate courses with her through UVA. She just is unbelievable. She's a scholar. She's also a musician and hit music at the Shallowford Presbyterian Church. So she amazes Sarah and I at the things that she does, and does beautifully, and I don't know when she sleeps. And I say that as a compliment, but not much. She is quite a scholar and quite a friend, and Sally will be doing part of the presentation. Charlie Rodenbaugh, I've known about 4 years. He called me about 4 years ago, and he said, we were working on this early Guilford County Courthouse out here at Sandy Ridge, and I'm interested. I've heard you have this problem, that you're interested in this stuff, and would you come out and so forth. And so I waited about 6 months, but we had already signed up as a resident of the future. I didn't tell him for about 6 months, and then I said, Charlie, we're going to be living on the Lindsay plantation. And he said, yes. So anyhow, but that was kind of cool, because we'd been involved with River Landing at that point some, and to find out there's something right around the corner that was of special interest hooked me big time. So Charlie was in the business world. He's a historian at heart, and did the business world. He's written 16 books, which blows me away. I used to struggle writing papers, so it's impressive. The things he's done. He's also done some things that I haven't really pursued involved with Russia. So I mean, it's I'm a big deal for me. It's Chapel Hill. So it's very impressive. So Charlie Rodenbaugh will be also assisting today, and Sally Gant is going to take over at this point, I think. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tom. It's a very kind introduction, and I'm honored to be here again and with Charlie sharing the podium. And for those who were not here last week, just to do a recap of a little bit about how we ended, but Charlie gave a wonderful...
Let me adjust your microphone.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
No problem.
Hold it up a little higher.
Yeah, I'm just going to move it right here. And then talk for us.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Is that okay?
Is that better?
Yeah? Okay, great. I'll try to speak out a little bit, more. But Charlie gave a wonderful recap of the history of this region where the Lindsay Plantation and the first Guilford County Courthouse are located. And I hope those handouts we gave last week might still be available. I'm not sure, but for those who weren't here, because that's a really good recap of this history. And what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to come back to looking at this house which is here in the center, which is the historical Lindsay Plantation House. And we'll finish up with looking at that and get you really adjusted to where it's located and what's happening with it today. But we're going to talk for a few minutes now about the people who lived in the house and the fact that we have these wonderful portraits that still survive today of Andrew and his wife Elizabeth, Dick Lindsay, and their two children, Mary Eliza and Susanna Julia, that are pictured in these portraits that were painted by an unknown artist who came to this area in 1826, stayed here for at least 2 years, and painted over 50 portraits at that time of people who were living here in Guilford County. The Guilford Limners, who we call that artist because of the name Guilford, of course, where the artist was working, and the word limner, which, as those of you who were here last week know, that is a period term that refers to a person who painted, took likenesses, or painted, or limned, or lined out. So that's how the name Guilford Limner comes about. We hope someday we'll be able to put a name to this artist. And thanks to the Greensboro History Museum in 1983, who did a wonderful exhibit and produced this small catalog that Tom has brought a copy of that's on the table here, that you can see, 1983, when we knew of 35 existing portraits at that time by this single artist. And nowadays, we've upped that number to 54 surviving portraits. And the handout that I've given you today is, it's a listing of all of the 54 portraits that we know of that come from Guilford County. The family names and who these people were. I don't have all of the faces here, but the names are there for you, and I don't encourage you to look at it much while we're talking, but because that's a temptation, I know. But you'll find lots of familiar names there. Names in your own family or names of families that you know, and I encourage you to look it over and spend some time with it and keep your eyes out. These little portraits are, the largest of them are the Lindsays that we have here that are to scale, the ones you see on the table that are about this big, but some of them are very small, about 7 by 9 inches, and they can be hidden away inside books or in manila folders or in file drawers, and so I keep hoping more will turn up, and they are. So I make you all assigned detectives of the Guilford Limner Project now. Keep your eyes open. And so the ones that have come to surface in the recent years, mostly stemming from the 2011 when 4 of these portraits showed up on the Antiques Roadshow, and they were the portraits of the Gibson family from Guilford County, Moses and Elizabeth and their 2 children. And those portraits have now come to us at Mazda. They turned out to be wonderful examples of the work of this artist. Many of the portraits are not signed by the artist, but inscribed with the name of the sitter, which is really important, and often the year in which they were painted, as the Gibsons, the case was with the Gibsons. And also, amazingly enough, many of the people who were painted by this Guilford Limner were Presbyterians, and a huge number of them were members at Buffalo Presbyterian Church, which, as Charlie talked last week about the Presbyterian Nottingham settlement, the group that came down from Pennsylvania in the 1750s, 60s, right? And a lot of these people were with that group, and many of them were members of Buffalo. This is a listing of the membership in 1830 who were actually paying for pews in the church in order to pay the salary for their minister. Many of those names had their portraits painted by the Limner. And neighbors of theirs a little further north in the county were the Simpsons. And Francis and his wife, Priscilla Simpson, built a house that Tom and Sarah Sears here were instrumental in saving the interior woodwork from. And Tom brought today this issue of the Seasons magazine that had a great article in it about the Searses and the house that they built here in Guilford, in Greensboro, but also the interior woodwork that they installed, which was the surviving period woodwork from this house in 1977, what was inside that house, and then how it was restored by Tom and Sarah, and also by the Greensboro History Museum, where there's a room. So Tom will be speaking to that subject to you, I know, soon. He needs to do that. So, free commercial, but you need to be doing that. So, anyway, so now we come to our house, the subject that we're talking about. And I understand several of you have already made the trip around the corner and actually found this house where it's standing on Sandy Ridge Road, not far from here at all. And when this project began, of course, this house and this site have always been recognized as the first courthouse of Guilford County. And the house that survives is the puzzle that many people have been spending a lot of time with, and Charlie gave us a really good introduction to that last week. And we're beginning to understand more and more about this site, about what's there archaeologically, under the ground, the fact that this building is in its relic condition is still standing on the property on which it was originally built, and it is also the remnant of what was there originally as far as a site which was owned by the Boyce family, or the Boyce family, and then the Lindsay family. And so our project today is to determine what's going to happen to this building, and that's what we'll be talking about a lot more today. But what I want to talk about right now is what went on inside that building. This is what we see today when we go into that building and climb up the ladder through a hole in the ceiling to the upper level. And you can see the brick nogging and the log framework that Charlie talked about with us and explained last week, which is a very early form of construction used in Salem, as well as in other areas around the county. That's what we have today. And you can see 2 window frames, you can see wainscoting, you can see chair rail, base molding that's still there in the house. And so what survives is an amazing thing if we look closely enough. So here, just in that same room that I showed you, underneath the stair going up to the attic, is this surviving door that still has its grained painting on top of it with the molding outlined in paint. And that brilliant, what is now rather dim, but was once brilliant blue surrounding to that little tiny door. And if you see that, then you can get a hint of what the woodwork in this house looked like about in the 1820s, 30s, when the Lindsay family were living there. Downstairs, where the woodwork has been highly compromised by the loss of the lower part of the house, a lot of the paneling has been moved around and put back in place in different areas. But this is one of just a few panels that survive that show this great example of yellow and blue grained woodwork, where they would paint the woodwork to imitate wood graining, but do it in brilliant colors that reflected the American fancy taste of that day, which is something that we're seeing in the paintings that we're looking as well. So if I show you this view of Elizabeth Lindsay and her daughter, you can see behind Julia, you can see what I'm talking about. This is probably a remnant of the paneling that was behind these two when they were painted by the Guilford Limner in 1827. And so we can get a sense, as with the rooms at Tom and Sarah's home and that they rescued, and the paintings of the Simpson family, where you can see the good example of a man and a woman who were painted in the house where they lived, with the example of that grained and interior decorating behind them. That house is no longer standing. What we have of this house that's still standing is giving us a lot to go on to understand what this house was like in the days when it was lived in spite of the relic that survives today. So we're so lucky to have that. Now, if we were able to glimpse through this window where the Lindsays were sitting, and first of all, you notice the beautiful roses that are growing around that window. I have no doubt at all that Elizabeth Lindsay had roses growing around her house, and that this is probably something that would have been there, if not peeping in the window, at least around the area. And Guilford Limner, as an artist, often did show examples of natural, not only just the interior woodwork, but some of the natural surroundings in which people were sitting in place. So this might be something. But if we could glimpse through that window, what would we expect to find? Well, the portraits give us a couple of good clues. For instance, both Elizabeth and Andrew are sitting next to tables that are decorated. So you'll notice this one has beautiful, colorful decoration here. And notice the chair that Andrew is sitting in and the mate to it that Elizabeth is in. These chairs absolutely did exist. We know that there were ornamental chair makers in Greensboro at that time. One of them, Samuel Shelton, actually had his portrait painted by the Guilford Limner, he and his wife, sitting in ornamented chairs. And a set of chairs survived in Samuel Shelton's family that even though they have been stripped, they still have the remnants of this brilliant yellow paint that was on those chairs. So we can see that. So we'll know that these were in the house. Also the table. And Elizabeth is sitting beside another small round table that may also have ornament. I can't remember now. I think it has a turned pedestal underneath. But what's important is also next to her is a vase with flowers in it. And I think this is probably what would have been termed at that time a Britannia vase, that it was not ceramic, but probably metal. These were very common at that time. And they're the kinds of things that many, many people saw, and many, many of the Guilford Limner's portraits show these vases with flowers. Even back in the early days when the Limner, before the Limner came to North Carolina, when he or she was painting in Kentucky in the years 1818 to 1825, many of those portraits have very similar vases with flowers. I don't think this was done just as a casual way to ornament a painting. I think it was actually what people had and what they used in their homes for the most case. So we have some clue about what was there in the house. We are so fortunate to have incredible documentation from the Lindsay family. Charlie has done an amazing job of transcribing many of these documents, including the inventory that we're looking at here and also the diary that Elizabeth Dick Lindsay kept. And he will talk about that in a little bit. But I'm just showing you a couple of pages. When a person died at that time, most often an inventory was taken of their estate. And I love to read these inventories because it's almost like being a peeping Tom. It's like you're walking from room to room and you can see what was in each room. In this case, when Elizabeth Dick Lindsay died in 1845, her property that she had inherited from her husband, Andrew, who had died just a few months before she died, was sold at a vendue sale or an auction. And the record of that sale is in the files at Guilford Courthouse. It's online, and it's amazing to see because you can not only see the list of items that were sold, but you can see who bought the items. And that is, you can almost close your eyes and imagine everybody from this neighborhood gathered around the house purchasing these items as they came up for sale at this auction, and they're all of their neighbors. And isn't it a great, I mean, you can just see. And many of the items were bought by her daughter, Eliza E. Lindsay, who was the older of the daughters, and I think went on into her family. So, but I'm just going to show you a couple of details from the estate sale. Here you can see just a couple of the things a few things. A bureau. Oh, excuse me. I don't want to do that. I want to go backwards first. I want to use my pointer. A bureau, 11 chairs there, andirons, candlesticks, a thermometer, a desk and bookcase, which was bought by her daughter, a corner cupboard, a looking glass, and then 100 pounds of bacon. So it was all mixed up in there. But that's the way these things were, and that's the way these records go. Another page. Here is a Britannia picture. And that Britannia picture could well have been the picture that we saw these flowers in, although it qualifies more as a vase or a ewer in my mind. But a glass bottle, look how many lamps there were. You can imagine they had to light that house, and so here they were, the lamps, jars, pitchers, a reflecting glass bottles, large dishes, red plates, a set of red plates, which would have probably have been earthenware. So in that case. And here you've got some of the books that were in that sale. They had a huge library, and it's a really exciting library to look at because you can see a lot of the most popular books of the day, books about religion. They had hymn books. In this case, in just a little section of that, you can see A Life of Harrison. There's 6 books, Murray's Grandma, A Life of Franklin. Then you have a work on silk. And we know that they were attempting to grow silk. They planted the mulberry trees. They raised the worms for the silkworms, and harvested those. And last week, somebody asked me about the silk at the Lindsay house, and so I did go into the diary, and I just excerpted all of the references in Elizabeth Dick Lindsay's diary to the silk culture that they practice. And they are little things like Mr. Lindsay brought some buds and some silkworm eggs. And then discovered the silkworms are commencing spinning cocoons. And so she's kind of tracing you through this. And then it gets to the really exciting part where she says that silkworms are done winding, and they have more than a half of a bushel of cocoons. Very nice peanuts. So she called them peanuts, and I think that's what the peanut referred to, was the cocoons. And then she goes on to say, commence spooling and doubling and twisting and spinning some silk. So she really was working it, and so that's really a neat thing. So she had a book on silk. She had a book on dyspepsia, and then a song book, and a hymn book, and another hymn book, and 2 more. Life of Wesley, this was the kind of thing that was really important at that day. And then another page, just a little snippet of some of the furniture. Bed and furniture meant the bedstead, the wood part, and the furniture was all the linen that went with it. The mattresses and the sheets and the pillowcases and all that kind of thing. You can see counterpanes, checked counterpanes, 4 checked counterpanes, a net curtain, a flax wheel. So all of these things, more beds and furniture and bureaus. So a house full of wonderful items. So every time you drive by that house, just imagine in your mind what was in that house and what was there as a part of Elizabeth Dick Lindsay and Andrew's household and where their children lived. Now, we do have a few surviving items that do still exist. This is one, these have turned up in the homes of descendants of the Lindsay, one particular descendant, as a matter of fact. And so I'm showing you this, and you can recognize this easily. This is a needlework sampler. This is the kind of work that a young girl would have done at her mother's knee, or she would have done in school, to help her learn the various stitches that she would need to use as an adult when she grew up in running her household. And so this is a sampler that is fascinating to me because of a couple of things it tells us. First of all, you can see on the lower left, if I can get this to work here, the name Martha E. Lindsay. And here's what I wanted to do, to highlight it. And her alphabet, and then underneath the numbers, and there was probably a date underneath which has been eradicated as the threads have gone away with time. Martha Lindsay was one of the children of Andrew and Elizabeth Lindsay. She was one of their older daughters. And this might have been done as early, say, as 18 or 19. We don't know, but she probably did that at her mother's knee in the house. And the reason we say this is the entire piece that you're looking at is a double sampler. The first part of this sampler was done at the top. And if you look at this and you think, that's not right, it's backwards, it looks not right. It looks like whoever did this was either confused or dyslexic or what was happening. But I'll tell you what it is that you're looking at. You're looking at the back of an early sampler that was actually dated 1808 and initialized ED for Elizabeth Dick. This sampler was stitched by Elizabeth Dick as a young woman when she was a student at the Salem Girls Boarding School in Salem. And if you go backwards, I won't go backwards, but you can see by some of the elements of this, the little birds, and there are other elements of this that are very classic Salem samplers that the girls were taught to do at Salem. So she was a student at Salem in 1808, and that's where she learned to do the needlework. This sampler was never completed. It got as far as she got with it. And she brought it home with her. She probably never framed it, never put it up. But when her daughter Martha got old enough to learn stitching, she pulled it out. And at the bottom of that piece of cloth, she just squared it out, and Martha used that as her sampler. Does that tell us something about Elizabeth Dick Lindsay? Frugal? Yeah, if nothing else, but also intent that her daughters would learn what she had learned and could carry on that important tradition. And so that's another wonderful thing. Another piece of hers that descended in the same family is this, and this is a wonderful example of a completed piece that she did at Salem Female Girls School, boarding school. She was there in 1808, which was the first year that the Salem Girls School admitted boarders. So she, her family was really intent on getting her to one of the best schools in the area when that was possible, and she boarded there for less than a year. But the time that she was there, she was very industrious, and she completed this incredibly beautiful silk on silk needlework picture. And this is a familiar scene. It's based on a print source of the time. And there's several of these that survived from Salem Female Boarding School that were done by other girls, so we could compare it to others. This is one of the nicest because you can't really tell this in it, but these little things that are stitched, these are sequins, and they sparkle. And when she did it, it really sparkled, I'm sure. It was really quite beautiful. And so it's pretty sure that this was actually framed and hanging in the house, because this is the kind of work that would not just be put away like just a sampler would have been in many cases. So we're pretty sure that this hung on the walls of the Lindsay house during the years that they were living there. And the beautiful flowers, the roses that she stitched, and the border around it really survive in pretty good condition. So that may explain also her interest in silk. This is another sampler that also descended in the family, and this was done by her daughter, Mary Eliza. This was done later. This one is dated 1841, but before I go on, I'll just point out the typical features of a sampler of that period with the alphabet and the numbers and the beautiful borders. And these were all what they call a sampler to teach a child, a little girl, how to do all of these different stitches that she would be able to use for her family clothing, for textiles in the home, linens for the table or for the bed, ornaments. So these were all that element of the early sampler. This was actually stitched in Greensboro. We're not sure of the school, but we're getting, my colleague at MESDA, Jenny Garwood, is working on this right now. And we've recently discovered another sampler that was stitched by the daughter of Samuel Shelton, the chair maker, probably at the same school. It's almost identical to this in many ways. And so we're working on this, and we may be able to tell you more. But here is little Mary Eliza when she was painted by the Limner in 1827, and this was her inscription that she stitched into her sampler in 1841 at the time in Greensboro. And you can see how neatly that is done as well. So that gives us just a little bit of a clue about this house that the Lindsays lived in and what might have been surrounding them or hanging on their walls. And I'll end with this great quote, which I found that was actually published in 1827, same year that these were painted. It was published in Columbia, South Carolina, and it's an advertisement for another artist, Robert Hanna, that I'm working on. But I love this quote because he said, "At a moderate price, the citizens and planters will have an opportunity of decorating their parlors and gratifying themselves and friends with their portraits, whilst they encourage an art which must be of lasting benefit to our country." So I love the fact that he's encouraging the citizens and the planters. And this is so important for us here with this farm, this plantation that was here in the country of Guilford County. These folks that were living out from the towns that were all around the county, taking the time and having the energy to not only build a wonderful house, but a wonderful selection of objects that furnished that house and made their lives and their material culture, as we call it, a surviving evidence of the lives that they lived. But they also were gratifying themselves and their neighbors. This is important with their portraits, because how else did an artist like our Limner find business that one neighbor told the next and the next and the next? And so that's how we see these things happening. So all of these things that survive tell us a little bit more about this. And speaking of the Salem Girls School, I mentioned last week that there was a group of women who were going to be making the journey that Charlie talked about last week from Pennsylvania down to Salem. That's actually happening right now. There's a group of women, I don't know how many, who are actually walking from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to Salem. And it's ongoing right now, and they'll be arriving in Salem next Tuesday afternoon. So, and I've got a little flyer if anybody wants to pick this up. But if you go on the Salem College website and just Google the 250th, you'll find the details, and you can come to Salem and welcome them. We're not going to have this happen very often, to welcome a group of very adventuresome women who have made that trek over 30 days. They started on September the 28th to arrive in Salem, so next Tuesday. Thank you, and I'm now going to turn this over to my friend Charlie, and he'll take us back into the house. So.
Let me go back one to what Sally was just talking
Can you
about.
want to push that button on your little, and I need to unpush mine.
Last time I forgot to take off my mask.
There we go.
There we are. You know, sometimes an occasion like this makes me think of the fact that what we're doing, I don't know whether any of you are fans of the CSI programs, investigation, crime scenes investigated. Well, sometimes Sally and I probably feel like we're doing that same thing in a different pattern, in a different genre, when we're working with history. And there are so many fascinating things that something like this bring up. As she points out, she's used the computer to imagine this picture on the wall as they would have had it somewhere in the house. It might have been anywhere in the house. Just this week, I ran across another Guilford connection where a well-known Philadelphia pewter maker, clock maker, cabinet maker named Kirk came south as a Quaker on a mission, and he came to Guilford County. And while he was in Guilford County, he picked up a young man named Thomas Jessup, who had been orphaned, and or his father and the rest of his family had died, but his mother was still alive. But anyway, she wanted to apprentice him. So she took him back to Pennsylvania, to Chester, and York County in that area, just outside of Philadelphia. And he took over, or became apprentice for Kirk. And Kirk died 3 years later, and he took over Kirk's business. And he ran it for the rest of his life until the 1850s. He took it over in 1784. So he ran it a long time. His work is known in Pennsylvania. He himself sent back to Guilford County and got a young man named Gardner, and he went to Philadelphia to be his apprentice. So we're looking at the depth of communication, the depth of interaction between the North and the South here, the crafts and the work that they were importing from Philadelphia and New York. It all begins to tell a story as you begin to put it together, like we're doing with the project here that is on this same property. It begins to fill out a story, just bits and pieces, very much like CSI puts together a story. So that is the thing that Tom and Sally and I are at just down the road from you. We've used a lot of different things, and today I want to kind of go through some of the star attractions, if you will, some of the things that they did connected with this particular plantation. Looking back at the Guilford Limner pictures that we just had up here, it's interesting, they were surrounded in this particular location particularly by Quakers. This was a Quaker settlement. It also had a settlement of the Nicolaites, who were a particular facet of the Quaker church. So they were strongly involved in Quakerism, and they were, through the Quakers, they were strongly interactive with the anti-slavery movement in this area. But here were the Lindsays, Presbyterians, right in their midst. If you can imagine, these are pictures of Presbyterians. If you notice, their clothing, their furniture, and so forth would not be seen in a Quaker house, which would have been much more plain, much plainer, and stripped of any kind of decoration of one sort or another. One of the things we've relied on routinely, and of course this is the thing that you do with all research in history, is you go back and try to find those folks who are still alive, who can remember and will record something that gives you kind of a base point from which to do your research. So we have got examples of floor plans of what people remember of this house when it was all the units of this house. This particular drawing is very useful because it also shows the outbuildings, the kitchen that is long gone. It shows the direction of where the cemetery is. It shows a lot of details that really connect us with the reality of what was there. So we rely on this kind of floor plan. Here we've got directions that if and when we try to reconstruct all or part of that particular building, we've got the height and measurements right here on this from somebody who actually was in the building when it was still there. Now, I think one of the prize things that Sally has talked about, has mentioned to you, is this diary, and I mentioned it last week too. Sally, let me get you have a copy of it, which you all can look at, but this is actually a copy of the diary itself and how it looked, what it looked like. There it is up on the top. Starts out in 1837 and goes to 1845, and we think that this is just one of her diaries, that she would not have just done this 8-year period at the end of her life, but that she was probably keeping a diary like this all along. As Sally says, she was involved, her diary itself talks about all sorts of details about what was going on in the house. Like the Limner is giving us an almost a photographic picture of who was there. This diary is giving us a written description of what they were doing there, which is really an unusual, complete kind of story. And out of it, we can begin to extrapolate and develop and realize how much this went on in this place. This was not just a plantation where they had a big house and the supporting log buildings all around it. This, as I said last time, was almost the form of an early industrial complex. It was also a plantation that was not living off the production of tobacco and cotton, although they did produce both tobacco and cotton, and they marketed it. But they had all kinds of things going on. They had a grist mill. They had silk production. They had a tan yard. They had weaving. They had a store there. They produced guns. And then as far as the agriculture is concerned, they were dealing with all the normal things that you think about, hogs and turkeys and chickens and cattle and sheep. There's a great description in here when you take her items of in the diary that are just glimpses of what they were doing that day, and you put all the things in there that are about a common subject, which is what Sally showed you. But if you take something like hog killing, for example, you get a full description of all the details of what they went through in terms of hog killing and processing for sausage and for the putting up of and curing of hams. You get the whole story in there. It's scattered out in the diary, but when you put it together, it gives you a complete picture of the operation itself. That kind of importance goes beyond just this particular land. And then, of course, there are the standard family things in there, which are births and deaths and the family and neighbors. And the churches, they, particularly in Andrew Lindsay's, the Guilford Limner pictures of the two, they became very much involved out of their roots in Presbyterian church. They drifted to the Methodist church. Well, one of the reasons the Methodists and the Baptists grew much quicker in our area was that Presbyterians demanded an educated ministry. And before the Revolutionary War, they would not accept a minister in the colonies who was not trained in Scotland, who actually had gone back to Scotland for his education. Of course, when we began to have schools over here, Princeton and others, Hampton, Sydney, they began to get their ministers out of those schools as well. But the Methodist Church was just booming in this area. Again, you can see the Quakers were leaving because of slavery. The Presbyterians had slaves and supported slavery. The Methodists were kind of in between. Many of them had slaves, but they also realized the inhumanity of slavery. So they kind of got the best of both worlds. People who were in the middle, who weren't either on one extreme or the other. And the Lindsays went into that category. So there are a lot of details in here about how they're going to camp meetings all around. They were constantly going to camp meetings. They belonged to one church, but within an area of probably 40 or 50 miles around, whenever there was a camp meeting going on or a meeting organizing a church, they were there. They were very active. All those things are coming to us through that diary, and the details are really magnificent. This is the tract as it existed under Andrew and Elizabeth. It was over 1,000 acres, typical plantations at that time. This is the antebellum period. Of 1,000 acres would have about 30 slaves. That was just kind of a rule of thumb. But those were plantations where they were particularly producing cotton and or tobacco. And I'm talking about North Carolina. They would have been different kinds of plantations in Mississippi and Alabama and so forth. But the typical plantation in North Carolina, well, the Lindsay plantation was different. He had all these other things that were going on. He needed labor, and so he had some slaves. And I want to spend some time talking about the slave community, but this was not a typical plantation that you would have found in North Carolina, where the slaves, the majority of slaves, were field hands. They literally went early in the morning into the fields and they came home at night when the bell rang or the conch shell was blown. And they worked the fields the whole time of the day. Well, when we look at the Lindsay story, we see a different story. They give us an entirely different story, but it's such a broad range of stories because they were not a typical cotton or tobacco plantation. Now, one additional thing I wanted, just as an aside as we're passing here, we've mentioned the cemetery several times. The cemetery, physically, we could go to early on, and there were six, I think, maybe seven, but marked graves. Andrew and his wife, one of his children, his father. So we thought there were other people there, and we thought probably somewhere down the hill was the slave graveyard where they would have been. And we wanted early on to try to establish what was there. So we brought in a man from Virginia with his ground penetrating radar, just as we'd done with the archaeologist from UNCG. And he did a ground penetrating radar survey of the cemetery. And he found an indication of up to 60 graves were in that cemetery. And this was not the slave graveyard. It was not on the side. This was the white Lindsay cemetery, literally. It could have had some of the Boyces buried in it earlier that were unmarked. But imagine our surprise when he comes back with a report. And his report, let me go on. I thought I had a slide on the report itself. But anyway, his report is fascinating because what you see is when you go into an old cemetery, you'll see depressions in the ground where obviously graves are. But when you do the ground penetrating radar, you see anywhere where soil was disturbed. So where you don't see the depression of the ground, the radar senses that this is a hole, that this has been dug out. And you can clearly see it, and you can count the number of depressions you have. That's how he's getting to the fact that it's some 60 graves in it. And I think we mentioned this last time, but one of the nice connections we've had with the Connett family, who own the property that the building is on, is the fact that their grandson was an Eagle Scout, and he needed an Eagle Scout program, and he took this on as an Eagle Scout program, and as a result, we now have it fenced with the split rail or the rail fence, and you can see how the graves are scattered back there. This is actually the gravestone for Andrew and Elizabeth. Unfortunately, somebody sometime has taken them up and laid them against a tree, so we don't quite know the specific location of their bodies, but we know where their gravestone is located. The slave grave we found was in the edge of the subdivision next to you, the Legacy subdivision. It was right on the edge of what used to be, as I understand, the golf course that was, or the golf course that is here. So right between the golf course and the Legacy is where the slave graveyard was. This is that kind of, oh, here we are. You see, this is the ground penetrating radar. And you see you see all these blue strips here. you can actually see a row of graves right here. And as he's studied it and worked it out, he's determined that there were about 60 graves out of that study. So summarizing the Lindsay family itself, just in that one generation of what we're talking about, Andrew and Elizabeth's generation, we have some of the founders of High Point, Winston, Lexington, Kernersville, and Greensboro. And Andrew Lindsay, Andrew Lindsay bought the first lot at the junction of the Fayetteville and Western Plank Road and the North Carolina Railroad, which is the main intersection in the center of High Point today. The Plank Road ran from Fayetteville to just near Winston. It was an expensive way to do transportation, but when it came in, it was looked on as the latest thing. The problem was that you ran these wagons full of hogsheads of tobacco and other things over boards and over logs, and you very quickly worn them out. So you had to have a constant supply of wood cut for the Plank Road to replace, we think we have potholes in present day highways. Imagine what you had on a log or a plank road. But anyway, that particular intersection, everybody talks about it as being the highest point on the North Carolina Railroad, which was led by John Motley Moorhead, who was married to a Lindsay. So they were all involved in both the transportation in both the plank roads and the railroads itself. Anne Elizabeth, I keep doing this, I'm sorry. Anne Elizabeth Lindsay married John Motley Moorhead, and he, in addition to being head of the North Carolina Railroad, was governor of North Carolina. He was a Whig governor, one of the few Whig governors, but he was very, very progressive for his time. John Alexander Lindsay was vice president of the National Bank of High Point and the High Point Coffin and Casket Company. Jesse Harper Lindsay was president of the National Bank of Greensboro. Dr. Robert C. Lindsay was the founder of High Point, and he bought 100 acres at that junction I'm talking about. So he bought originally the center of what became High Point. Jane Lindsay married Jesse Hargrave, and he became the founder of the town of Lexington and the county of Davidson, which is just south of here, of course. Mary Eliza Lindsay married Wyatt Bowman, and he was the first president of Wachovia Bank and Trust. And from him and the next generation, you get Bowman Gray School of Medicine, all the connections with the Bowman, the Grays, and the Reynolds. This generation alone had 7 doctors, and they constructed 3 medical schools. They started 3 medical schools. That's the kind of impact they had as individuals. Now, we've both talked a lot about this property in white terms, but we have become cognizant of the fact, and we all have to kind of force ourselves into being cognizant of the fact that you've got another story there about which there is very little written, and therefore you only have tools like archaeology to really hear the early story of the slave population. They were critical to what was the Lindsay plantation, but they weren't the typical field hands of most plantations in North Carolina. And this is what makes them doubly interesting, because they're all connected with these different things that they did at the Lindsay plantation itself. We have the names of the slaves. We have them for a period from 1790 to 1848. Almost 60 years we have who was there, and you see that the top group were there the whole time. So they weren't buying and selling slaves. This was not part of what they were employing and training people that they needed for labor. And we have used in our research an analysis of a lot of different sources to begin to tell us about these slaves. We've got slave sales, which are scattered all through the books of Guilford County court records. We've got the wills of both Robert Lindsay and Andrew Lindsay, because when they died, when the master died, this was property. The slaves were property. So they had to be divested in some way. And typically of most families, they tried to give each of the children a few slaves. So all that helped us identify who they were. And then the census records of this period between 1790 and 1840. But we've additionally got all these things that Elizabeth Lindsay wrote about in her diary, and the daily functioning of these slaves, what they are involved in and how much they're involved in. Now, I'm going to say more in detail about that when we get into the question of the silk production. But when you analyze just, say, the census of 1840, and usually when you pull up a census in one of these genealogical tools that they've got, like Ancestry.com or something like that, you'll find a very impersonal kind of list where they list by number slaves by age and white people by age. So this is how they recorded what was on the Andrew Lindsay plantation. But when you begin to break it down, you begin to tell your story more. CSI kicks in. And you realize that in the slave community that they had, which was by 1840, which was 20 people, 12 of the 20 were under 21. Now, the significance of that is that these were children whose labor was limited. There were only so many things that the children could do. So they were taking care of these 20 underage, if you would, children as part of the slave community. And we know from this then that the Lindsays themselves were cognizant of family and were appreciated family as it related to the slave community as much as they did appreciate it in their own family. Employment, and here's where you get the clues to the fact that this is not a tobacco or cotton plantation, because they listed only 5 of the slaves as in agriculture. 1 they listed in commerce, and 5 they listed in manufacturing and slaves. So half the slaves on the plantation were involved in something other than being field hands, which is a real significant difference. And then there were 10 free whites there. Now, when you take out half of them as the family, you realize that they also had white people hired to do some of these skilled labor points or skilled labor jobs. It was possible for us in a couple of cases to actually be able to develop a family tree for two of the slave communities. And probably probably they had 3, maybe 4 family groupings of slaves themselves, and we were able to reconstruct these. But beyond this, we were able to then, using her diary, taking the slave records that are in the public record, the work at Guilford County, and analyzing other things to actually create stories about individual slaves. So we have now not only a slave list, but we've got a short biography of Albert, and then an even longer biography of Allen and all the other slaves listed on that original list. And look at Allen's day and his period as it begins to show up. Allen plowed the Irish potato patch and ridge this morning, and now Ann and Allen are planting it over with slips. They planted 7 rows, cut the 7 pieces, then primes of them in the lower yard, and the balance brought from the lower patch to plant 7 more rows, evidently, up closer to the house. 2 days later, Allen was plowing up the patch above the barn that they had put in. In February, Eliza planted 2 double rows of peas, cabbage, lettuce, and beets, and Ann sent seeds for Allen to sow in the tobacco patch. Anyway, these little, as I say, bits of information about the individual slave, when you begin to put it all together under the slave names and separate them out, you get what is almost a shadow biography of these slave individuals. And it's very unusual to be able to do that. So they were conducting all the things that involve the cultivation of the garden. The filling of the ice house fascinated me. In the late fall, all the neighbors would come together and they'd go to the pond that backed up at the mill, and they would cut ice, and they'd start filling up the ice houses all around the area. And it was quite an operation because it was all hands on board to do that. It's the same thing for hogs. When they in November would kill hogs, all the neighbors would come. Everybody would do it together. Many of you are from the Midwest, and you know the corn planting and shucking and all. These would be group functions where the neighborhood came together to do this kind of function. So we're able to get all this, individual information about the slaves and their domestic chores. When we're looking at, for example, weaving and putting together cloth, they had here at the bottom, we've got, and 45 yards wove jeans for Negro men, and it made 5 long tail cuts and overalls, 6 pairs of large ones, 2 short ones for Spencer and Harry, so they must have been shorter slaves, 1 pair of pantaloons apiece, and Armistead a pair of jeans. Put in Wednesday after Christmas, had another piece, 47 and a fraction, for women's clothes, had some mixed filling left, and have woven, the diary doesn't flow like an author might do, and for Jerry, and the coat waistcoats for Armistead, and for the first one, for his first winter coat. And this kind of detail is just miraculous to have, but it gives us a whole picture of the individual slaves, this one particularly being Henry. Now, we've got two families. We've got the Lindsay, the white family, and we identified the slave family. Now, when Andrew was going back and forth to Philadelphia to buy supplies for his stores, and now the family had stores in Greensboro, so when he went on a buying trip to Philadelphia, he was buying for several of the stores. Higher class goods for the stores in Greensboro, more country farmer goods for the folks that were coming to the plantation. And you look at the family and you see that there are the survivors of Andrew are all girls except one. The youngest child is another Andrew. The tradition in the South was the oldest child, oldest son, inherited the plantation, primogeniture. It's the old story from England. And that was still hanging on as a tradition kind of thing. Well, there wasn't an oldest son. The sons had all died within a year of birth, except Andrew. He was the youngest. He was still a minor. And suddenly, Andrew, the father, comes back from one of his buying trips to Philadelphia, and he's ill, and he suddenly dies. And within 3 months, for some reason, we haven't pinned it down exactly, Elizabeth dies. And within 2 months of that, this is all in the wintertime, one of their daughters dies, who dies in childbirth. So there was a concentration of tragedy in the Lindsay family and that generation at that time. Here was this plantation with all these industries and everything going on, and the only son is a minor, and he is going to inherit all of it. His older sisters either are married or soon will be married, so they're almost all of age. And the question now is for the Lindsays, and it is the reason why the Lindsay plantation is sold to other people, and after the Civil War, it has a whole additional history to it. But here they've got adult female children who are married to men who are going to found Lexington, North Carolina, and are going to found Winston, North Carolina. And these are movers and found banks in Greensboro and Winston and all. These are movers and shakers that they're married to. And their wives, family, plantation, now the master's dead. The mistress is dead. You got to do something about it quick because you've got a 13-year-old child who has been willed this whole plantation. He hadn't been trained to run the plantation. He doesn't know anything particularly about it. They thought that his mother, if his father died, his mother would be around for years to help him with it. She dies right afterward. So you've got a real tragedy going on in the white family. Well, look at the black family. They knew that in any kind of slave community on a plantation, when the master died, something was going to happen to them. But they had no input to what it was, and they had no knowledge about what the white family was thinking about. They only knew that the master and mistress are dead and something's going to happen to us. So the air of tragedy at this time is permeated both the black and the white community in a dramatic kind of way. And unfortunately, the result on plantations at that time was that families were split up. Well, with the Lindsays, they tried to keep the families together and give them to one or the other of the female members of the family. So imagine all this dramatics going on. Suddenly the master dies, suddenly the mistress dies unexpectedly, and their daughter dies in childbirth, and now all the slaves suddenly know that their lives are going to change. They're going to move off the plantation, and they're going to be in sad shape. I'm going to move on fairly quickly to these things. Lindsay had a gold mine. You know, everybody wants to have a gold mine, don't they? Gold had been discovered in Guilford County as early as 1774. We have a record of a survey of gold that was discovered in Guilford County that was sent to Governor Josiah Martin, the last colonial governor of North Carolina. So it was known about that early, before the Revolutionary War. But it is said that it's in the late 1820s when North Carolina gold is really discovered in Cabarrus County on the Reed Plantation. And we have the first gold rush, which is only superseded in 1848 by the California gold rush. But North Carolina was the gold rush state to begin with. Lindsay had a mine. This is a picture. I don't know how many of you have been to the McCulloch or know of the McCulloch mine in Guilford County. It's worth a field trip for you sometime. It is the remainder of a mine with the building. Most of the building is still there. They use it as a kind of a conference center. And in the middle of it has this rock engine crushing house, because the gold that was found in this area was all put into quartz, inserted in quartz. And you had to get it out some way. So they had to crush the quartz to get out the gold from the veins. And this was an iron crusher or a rock crusher right in the center that was the McCulloch mill. Here is half a mile away is the Lindsay mill. He was involved in 3 actual mills, and it is one of the main things that he was able to leave to each of his children. I'm not going to go further into the process, but add this to all the things that he was doing, including the silk mill, which Sally has talked about here. Now imagine this silk mill thing. This is a fantastic story, and I'll tell it quickly. A traveling salesman comes along, and what he is peddling is Macusulus mulberry trees. It's a word you find in the diary, and when I ran across the diary, I said, what in the devil is that? Never heard of it. Well, it's a particular kind in the 1830s that they developed of mulberry trees, which grew very well in the South, in this area. So they were peddling, the peddler had mulberry trees for sale. He also had these peanuts and the pods for the worms. And what he was doing was coming around to people like the Lindsays, who were receptive to the idea of a new industry, and said, why don't you start raising silk? And all they knew about, of course, was what we think about as silk from China. And this was a way to bypass all the trade costs from China. And the Lindsays said, okay, we'll try it. Well, the job fell to Elizabeth mainly. Andrew planted the trees. The leaves of the trees were what the worms ate. The worms went into a pupa stage, and out of it, they came as silk spinners. They were able to take and wind the silk just as they had been able to wind wool or other yarns, and they were able to use their own existing house looms to weave the silk. So all of a sudden they had the whole process right here on a plantation of something they had never known anything about to begin with, from trees to worms to silk. They were producing it, and they were trying to teach their slaves to do it too with them. They planted mulberry trees apparently all over this area for their worms. And they did produce. They had a building in which they kept their silk worms as they were going through these various stages, and they had to be very careful and cared for in particular ways. And all these things, you know, it was like a man coming through, and why don't you go into the rabbit business? I want to sell you some rabbits because you can do all these things with it. But imagine first of all, imagine what this meant when it was presented to them, and imagine how imaginary you'd have to be to buy it, to buy into the idea, to take the fish hook and get into it. But the Lindsays did, and although they only did it during Andrew's lifetime because his son wasn't able to carry on the business, and it ended there, but it probably would have continued much longer. So we come to the end of really the story of the Lindsays and their plantation. This map is an 1808 map. By this time, pretty much of our area, as we went into the 19th century, had been not only been settled, but it was organized. And they'd gone through this stage of becoming Americans that was important to the transition or the pre-Civil War period of time. But we've given you the story of this family and the Boyce family on this particular location, where it is and what it is. It is not just a building that was a plantation house. This is a building that was many things, and through the family, many things were done here. There is a fascinating story still unwinding about them. We are delighted to be here to bring you into the story in this form. It would be our hope that we'd bring you in even further. And when I say you, I'm really talking broadly about River Landing. Because we've realized in the period of COVID that this whole area, right here where Sandy Ridge Road goes into Squire Davis Road and Johnson Street, right there where it crosses the Deep River, has been in transition while we've been locked up. You know, when we get out and start moving around and look at this, we've got at this particular location what Benjamin Briggs from Greensboro calls a three-legged stool situation. I like to look at it as, I call it a synergy pod. A group of things that have come here that suddenly when you look around, you realize they're interactive synergy. you realize that you've got River Landing here, and you've got through Jim and his work here, you've got an education program going on. It's not elaborate. You don't have a lot of professors. You're doing a lot of it within the community itself. You're bringing in some other people, but it's at heart education. It's continuing education for those who are retired. I just about said retarded. I didn't mean that. Retired. And then right across the street, you've got a brand new academy that's moving here, which is going to be a huge place over there. And it's education for school children. And you've got just down the street, the Boyce Lindsay House, which is an historic preservation project, which ties into education as well. And when you get down to the foot of the hill and you've got the river, you've got the High Point Greenway coming through there. Eventually, that's already in the planning stages. And you put all those things together and you begin to see a certain synergy about it. Those things are all continuous learning, continuous appreciation of our environment. And they're all, as far as High Point is concerned, they're all located here. It's in High Point's best interest to look at this area and say, this is a transformative area. It can be almost a model for what you can do in other cities, in other towns where you have this synergy coming together. It's just looking around and seeing what you've got and then applying it. I'll give you, this is a far outside the box thought. What if the area down at that river, which is just the headwaters of the river, and you hardly see how much water is coming through there, but what if that was the High Point Bog Garden? And that at the back end of it, connected right with the Greenway, you're connected with River Landing. You've got another site to enjoy that's part of you. High Point gets a bog garden, and by the way, it's one of the only cities around here that doesn't have some sort of botanical garden or bog garden of some sort. And we've taken in the whole area and kind of brought it together in its common interests so that it can be worked together for what it can give to each other. Each of those projects can profit by being associated with the other. Now, I didn't say merged or anything like that. I'm talking about association. It's the exact example that Jim has when he comes to River Landing and he associates with River Landing something that he's been involved in all his life in the free academies, and he brings the idea to River Landing, and you're much broader in what you have and your interest areas, and you grow because of that association. It's the same principle, just working out further. And we would like to think that this may be today and last Tuesday or last Wednesday, a kind of a first step at putting such a long-term program together. In April, I'm going to be 90 years old. And I know that what I'm talking about right now may very well not be within my lifetime. You may be thinking, well, it's certainly not going to be in my lifetime at River Landing. But I like to think in terms of continuity, what we're passing on, what's going to be here for other people, and potentially what it can be. So we'd like to take the assets that we've identified at the Boyce Lindsay House and the energy and the research that we've set up there and combine it with what you have here to really expand this whole area. Now, I've really taken up all our time, and I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. But
I was going to say these next slides, Charlie, that we have here.
oh, okay. Here you see Sandy Ridge Road coming off the interstate. From 68 over here, you have, and then down to River Landing and the Lindsay Place. You see your proximity to the community in that. And this was just kind of a summary sheet of what we were doing. But I wanted to give you all a chance to ask questions. You got any more that you'd like to hear about or ask us about?
Come on, you got questions, I know you do. Thank you, Nancy. Oh, put back the last slide, okay, that's.
This one, go back to this? Okay. All right, here is Interstate 40. Here is 68. Here's the airport. And then you're coming down Sandy Ridge Road right here. Sandy Ridge Methodist Church up here. You're coming to River Landing, and you're coming to the Lindsay Place. And down here, these bridges are crossing the Deep River. So what we're talking about in terms of the synergy group, you're talking about down here, because High Point has plans for the Greenway to come right down this way and go right around High Point already.
Oh, coming, Gwen, hold on.
Is the area on Johnson Street where that big barn is, just past where the school site to be, is that part of this Lindsay Plantation as well?
I'm sorry, I didn't get all of that.
All right, going down Johnson Street.
Right.
Past the area where the school will be.
Right.
There is a big barn over on the right, a farm area. Is that part of the Lindsay Plantation as well?
No, it isn't. It isn't now. That would be north of here, right? Or if you go on Johnson Street, which is across the river and back toward High Point, you actually have the building that was built by William Boyce's brother. And it's another building connected with this same story, but it is not part of what Tom calls our mutual plantation.
We have a question back here from Becky.
How could we get involved with promoting a bog garden?
Well, I think I'm suggesting, I don't know, I haven't carried it much further than just taking it off the top of my head today. I would think that the work we're doing, since we're already organized and connected with the High Point Preservation Society, and that's a 5013C, so there's the ability to raise money under it, that's part of the beginning of getting it started. But we like to have interest here, and I'd like to meet with the staff and talk about that possibility. So we're really early in the conceptual part of this. It's just, I bring it to you as a concept. I bring it to you as a possibility. We're having to raise money by grants. So we love any contributions to the Preservation Society. But we're having to raise money by grants and build the whole idea. But you got to get the idea accepted by a lot of people. In other words, I've given you my thinking and my chain of thought that brought me to this place, but it's not yours yet. You've got to talk about it and think about it, and River Landing Organization has to be thinking about it. They've got to be thinking about it in terms of, this is a retirement center. It is enclosed, it's not a recreation center. They're not asking for people in High Point to come here and, swim in our swimming pool. So we've got to recognize the interests of each group. The academy is for teaching young people. They've been over and looked at our work, and they like the fact that they're going to have an educational potential right across the street from them. We've met with the city parks and recreation people, and we've heard about their Greenway program from them. We haven't proposed the Greenway. They already have it on the drawing board, but we've begun to give them ideas like, and we'll be passing this one on to them, the bog garden. It's perfect. High Point doesn't have one. It is at the foot of the hill. It is a bog. Making it into a garden is just a natural next step, it seems to me. And it's the kind of thing that people like you would be very much interested in.
I think also we can have Benjamin Briggs come up and talk, which puts some of this together from that perspective also.
That perspective too, yeah. So what I'm giving you is an embryonic idea, and we are working on ginning it up, if you will. We'll be in touch with the administration here. If there is personal interest, then you can speak up, or we'll keep you informed about it. And my gosh, you've got a wonderful newsletter where information goes out, so we'll keep you informed about it. Tom will keep you informed about it, what we're doing.
Thank y'all very much. I'm fortunate to be around these scholars, and we appreciate your interest. And if y'all want to pursue this in other ways, then we talk to Jim and whatever, and we'll do what we can. There's more. There are more things that we can show or bring in if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Obviously, there's interest in it.
Yeah.